Some weeks seem determined to remind you that reality has absolutely no interest in being believable. You wake up Monday morning thinking you'll spend the day worrying about whether you remembered to answer an email, whether you should finally throw away that mysterious container in the back of the refrigerator, and whether you've become old enough to genuinely appreciate orthopedic pillows. Instead, by lunchtime, the news has already sprinted past anything your imagination could have produced. One headline announces a historic confirmation to the United States Supreme Court. Another declares that one of the world's richest men has suddenly become involved with one of the internet's loudest public squares. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, a war continues to unfold with such horrifying images that every news broadcast feels like it's apologizing simply for existing. That is the strange thing about modern life. Every day feels like three completely different centuries crashing into one another. One moment we're celebrating progress. The next we're discussing billionaires treating social media companies like collectible action figures. And then we're confronted with images so heartbreaking that comedy itself starts wondering whether it should quietly excuse itself from the room. People often assume that comedians enjoy making jokes about everything. That isn't true. Sometimes there simply isn't a joke. Sometimes there's only disbelief. Sometimes the only honest reaction is staring at the television and asking, how did we end up here? The reports coming out of Ukraine were exactly that kind of moment. Photographs emerged showing civilians lying in streets where ordinary life had once existed. Neighbourhoods that should have been filled with children riding bicycles and neighbours arguing about lawn maintenance had instead become symbols of unimaginable suffering. You would think that the existence of overwhelming evidence would settle any debate. History, unfortunately, has demonstrated that evidence and agreement are not close friends. There will always be someone willing to insist that what everyone can plainly see somehow isn't happening. Watching certain broadcasts from Russian state television became an experience unlike anything else. Not because they presented another side of the story. Every conflict has competing narratives. No, this was something stranger. It was as though reality itself had become optional. The explanation offered to viewers seemed to change every few sentences. The people shown on screen weren't really civilians. Actually, they were civilians. No, wait, they were actors. But they had also somehow been murdered by their own government while simultaneously pretending to be dead. Listening to this explanation felt less like hearing propaganda and more like overhearing someone trying desperately to explain why there was a giraffe sitting in their kitchen. At some point, the explanation becomes so complicated that it defeats its own purpose. Successful lies tend to be elegantly simple. I'm stuck in traffic, my phone died, I swear the dog already looked like that. Those are believable because they don't require charts. The moment your lie requires a timeline, supporting documentation, and what appears to be three alternate dimensions, you've probably wandered off course. Imagine introducing your imaginary girlfriend, not she goes to another school. Instead, she's actually identical triplets sharing one driver's license. They alternate weekends existing physically, and technically one of them is from the future. Nobody hears that story and thinks, seems reasonable. They slowly begin backing toward the nearest exit. Yet somehow international propaganda occasionally operates with exactly that level of confidence. It simply keeps adding impossible details, hoping quantity eventually transforms into credibility. It doesn't. It merely becomes exhausting. At one point, commentators even suggested that the very name of the town somehow proved the entire tragedy had been staged. The logic, if one can generously call it that, relied almost entirely on a coincidence involving similar sounding words. That's not analysis. That's playing Scrabble with geopolitics. By that standard, we'd all avoid visiting perfectly innocent towns simply because they accidentally sound dramatic. Geography would become one enormous superstition. No. Never vacation there. Why? It rhymes with doom. Meanwhile, the actual evidence, photographs, eyewitness testimony, satellite imagery, independent investigations continued piling higher. Facts accumulated patiently. Facts usually do. They don't shout, they don't trend, they simply exist, waiting for people willing to acknowledge them. Propaganda, on the other hand, never seems content. It always needs another explanation, another twist, another increasingly desperate attempt to convince viewers that black is secretly white, up is actually down, and perhaps gravity has recently become optional. One especially bizarre claim involved footage supposedly proving that bodies had been staged using mannequins, except attentive observers quickly discovered that the clip being used wasn't connected to Ukraine at all. It came from a television production filmed somewhere entirely different. That's the problem with recycling fictional footage. Eventually, somebody recognizes the set decoration. Reality has an irritating habit of checking your homework. And still the explanations continued, because propaganda isn't really designed to persuade everyone. It only needs to persuade enough people that certainty becomes impossible. If every fact can supposedly be questioned forever, then eventually exhaustion replaces truth. People stop asking what's correct. They simply give up asking altogether. That may be the most dangerous outcome of all, because confusion is remarkably useful. Someone who doesn't know whom to believe often ends up believing whoever sounds most confident. Confidence, unfortunately, has never been evidence. If it were, every man explaining cryptocurrency at a backyard barbecue would deserve a Nobel Prize. The sad truth is that wars are fought not only with weapons, but with stories. Every side attempts to shape how events are remembered. One version seeks documentation. Another manufactures doubt. The difference matters enormously, because history eventually becomes tomorrow's memory, and memory determines what people choose to prevent or repeat. Eventually, I realized something uncomfortable. Comedy could certainly mock absurd propaganda. It practically begged for ridicule. Ridiculous claims deserve laughter because laughter strips away the illusion of authority. But comedy also has limits. Some images resist punchlines. Some tragedies require silence before satire. That balance is difficult. Eyes horror entirely, and you seem detached focus only on horror, and you've accidentally become the evening news. Finding the line between those worlds feels like tightrope walking across an active volcano. Then, as though the universe worried everyone might accidentally catch their breath, attention shifted to an entirely different subject, a television network, not one known for careful journalism, not one celebrated for nuanced reporting. Quite the opposite. This particular channel had built a reputation for embracing stories that other organizations rejected because they possessed troublesome qualities like being false. It had become a favorite destination for viewers convinced every mainstream institution was conspiring against them. If another outlet reported rain, this network would ask whether water itself had become politically biased. If scientists announced gravity remained operational, someone would inevitably suggest conducting additional research. Its programming often felt less like journalism and more like improv theatre, where every performer had been given the same instruction. Whatever everyone else believes, say the opposite with tremendous confidence. Then came unexpected news. One of the company's largest television distributors announced it would stop carrying the channel. Suddenly, an organisation accustomed to broadcasting outrage became the subject of outrage itself. Watching the reaction was fascinating. Anchors discussed the decision with all the restraint of someone announcing their favourite restaurant had replaced French fries with steamed kale. They seemed almost physically unable to say the distributor's name aloud, as though pronunciation alone might summon unspeakable evil. I refuse to mention them. An interesting editorial policy. Imagine applying that standard everywhere. We're following a major hurricane today, although I won't identify which state it's hitting because, frankly, I'm still upset. News generally works better when nouns are permitted. The network's business model had relied heavily on that distribution agreement. Losing it represented more than an inconvenience. It threatened survival, which perhaps explained why lawsuits soon followed. When institutions begin arguing over contracts worth enormous sums of money, everyone suddenly discovers a previously hidden passion for legal terminology. K multiplied, accusations flew. Entire paragraphs appeared containing phrases that sounded simultaneously dramatic and deeply exhausting. Among the complaints was an allegation that criticism aired elsewhere had unfairly damaged the network. That caught my attention. Not because criticism existed. Public figures receive criticism every day. It comes free with visibility. What amused me was discovering that comments I'd made months earlier had apparently found their way into legal filings. Imagine opening a lawsuit and unexpectedly discovering yourself quoted inside. It's a peculiar feeling. Like accidentally appearing in someone else's family vacation photos. Apparently, remarks comparing the channel to a more shameless version of partisan television had not been universally appreciated. Neither had observations about some of its more colourful personalities. One description in particular still made me laugh, not because it was especially cruel, mostly because it felt oddly specific. Sometimes the right comparison simply arrives fully formed in your brain and refuses to leave. You don't choose it, it chooses you. And once spoken aloud, there's really no retrieving it. The network, unsurprisingly, disagreed. Lawsuits tend to feature very little agreement. That's almost their defining characteristic. Still, there was something strangely poetic about an organisation that had spent years questioning nearly everyone else, suddenly objecting to criticism directed its own way. Freedom of expression always sounds magnificent. Until someone expresses an opinion you dislike. Then suddenly everyone becomes an amateur constitutional scholar. The entire episode served as an oddly fitting transition into a much broader realisation. Information had become the world's most valuable currency. Not truth, not wisdom. Information: who has it, who controls it, who shapes it, and who profits from it? That question, I would soon discover, extended far beyond television networks and international propaganda. It reached into laptops, phones, shopping carts, web browsers, even the smallest digital footprints we leave behind every single day. And once I started following those footprints, I found myself entering an industry so enormous, so invisible, and so unsettling that it made political misinformation seem almost straightforward by comparison. If propaganda is about controlling the story people believe, then the internet has quietly perfected something even more ambitious. It wants to know the people listening to the story, not in the warm, old-fashioned sense of getting acquainted. Not by asking your favourite movie or remembering your birthday. No, it wants to know you the way an accountant knows a spreadsheet. Every click, every pause, every purchase, every search, every tiny decision gets collected until a surprisingly complete picture begins to emerge. The unsettling part is that this doesn't happen because someone is sitting behind a computer personally watching you. That would almost be comforting. At least then you'd know who to yell at. Instead, the observation happens automatically. Millions of little digital systems quietly make notes about your life while barely announcing their presence. 1 minute you're searching for hiking boots because your friend convinced you to spend a weekend outdoors. The next minute, every website you visit suddenly becomes convinced you've dedicated your life to mountaineering. You open a weather app. Boots, you check sports scores. Boots, you read about movie reviews. Still boots. Eventually, you begin wondering whether the internet thinks you've joined an expedition to climb Everest using nothing but determination and a credit card. We've all experienced something like that. Buy one oddly specific item online, and suddenly advertisements begin following you around like an overly affectionate golden retriever. Sometimes it's merely annoying. Other times it's strangely impressive. You casually mention needing a new coffee maker, and somehow your phone decides that coffee is no longer just a beverage, it's your entire identity. But that irritation is only the visible part of a much larger system. The advertisements are simply the receipt. The actual transaction happened long before you ever saw them. The real business isn't selling you shoes or coffee makers. The real business is selling information about you. That realization hit me the deeper I looked into companies most people have never even heard of. They're called data brokers. The name sounds almost reassuring. Brokers suggest polite professionals in sensible jackets helping information find a nice home. In reality, they're more like invisible wholesalers dealing in tiny pieces of your life. Individually, those pieces seem harmless. Collectively, they become remarkably revealing. Every website visit, every loyalty card, every app installation, every online purchase, every location your phone quietly records, each one becomes another breadcrumb. One breadcrumb tells almost no story. 1 million breadcrumbs can practically write your autobiography. Imagine someone following you around for several years with a notebook. They never interrupt, never introduce themselves, never ask permission. They simply write, grocery store. gas station, gym doctor's office, airport, home. Repeat that process day after day, month after month, year after year. Eventually they know your routines almost as well as you do. Only now imagine that notebook being copied, sold, analysed, combined with thousands of other records and shared with companies you've never met. That's essentially the business model. The remarkable thing is how ordinary the process feels from our perspective. Nothing dramatic happens. You aren't stopped on the sidewalk. Nobody interviews you. You simply live your life. Meanwhile, an invisible economy quietly develops around the details you unknowingly produce. The internet likes to describe itself as free email, free maps, free social media, free news, free games. It's an astonishing bargain, almost suspiciously astonishing, because history has taught us one dependable lesson. When something genuinely appears free, you're probably paying in a currency you haven't recognised yet. In this case, that currency is information. Your attention, your habits, your preferences, your routines, your digital reflection. Companies aren't generously giving away services because they've collectively become saints. They're making investments. Every convenient feature encourages another interaction. Every interaction produces another data point. Enough data points eventually come products, and products get sold. One expert described data brokers as the middlemen of surveillance capitalism. That phrase stuck with me. It sounds like the title of an action movie that somehow cost $200 million. Despite being mostly about spreadsheets, picture an impossibly handsome leading man walking away from exploding databases in slow motion. He's not a spy. He's not a hacker. He's the middleman. Somewhere a Hollywood executive is already nodding enthusiastically. The reality is considerably less glamorous. Instead of dramatic car chases, you have servers quietly exchanging information while algorithms make educated guesses about your life. Sometimes those guesses are accurate. Sometimes they're hilariously wrong. Anyone who's ever accidentally clicked on a gift for someone else knows exactly how bizarre those assumptions become. Buy your nephew dinosaur toys once and suddenly every website decides you're raising a prehistoric family. Congratulations. The internet now believes you're personally responsible for Jurassic Park. But businesses don't stop at guessing individual interests. They organise people into categories. Not because categories are interesting. Because categories are profitable, marketing has always depended on grouping people together. The internet simply industrialised the process. Instead of broad descriptions like young professionals or parents, modern databases create astonishingly specific profiles. Every category becomes another opportunity to predict behaviour. Will this person buy camping equipment? Luxury watches? Organic vegetables? Video games? Premium dog food? The more specific the prediction, the more valuable the profile becomes. On paper, it all sounds oddly clinical, harmless even, until you realise some categories involve subjects no stranger should reasonably know: medical conditions, financial difficulties, family circumstances, major life events, things most people mention only to close friends or trusted professionals. Suddenly the idea becomes considerably less abstract. Picture walking into a store where every employee already knows whether you're recovering from surgery, whether you're struggling financially, whether you're expecting a child, whether you've recently lost someone you loved. Not because you told them, because somebody sold that information. That possibility stopped feeling theoretical once I encountered examples demonstrating exactly how much data could circulate. People dealing with illnesses, expectant mothers, individuals facing depression, communities sorted according to intensely personal characteristics. None of these people volunteered to become marketing categories. They simply existed. Someone else transformed that existence into inventory. It's astonishing how quickly technology normalises things that would sound absurd anywhere else. Imagine your neighbour standing outside with binoculars, watching who visits your house, recording every package delivered, keeping notes about your daily schedule. Eventually, you call the police. Palm the binoculars with software, however, and suddenly investors call it innovation. There's an extraordinary amount of faith placed in the phrase anonymous data. We're repeatedly assured that names have been removed, that personal identities remain protected. Everything has supposedly been stripped down into harmless numbers. That sounds reassuring. Until you remember how astonishingly unique ordinary lives actually are. Age, gender, occupation, neighbourhood, daily commute, favourite grocery store, weekend routines. Combine enough seemingly ordinary details and anonymity begins disappearing remarkably quickly. It's like assembling a jigsaw puzzle. One piece reveals almost nothing. 200 pieces reveal someone's living room. Researchers have repeatedly demonstrated that identifying supposedly anonymous individuals often requires surprisingly little effort. People leave patterns behind, paws become signatures, signatures become identities. The remarkable thing is how predictable humans actually are. We think of ourselves as spontaneous. We're not. Most of us eat breakfast around the same time, drive similar routes, visit familiar stores, return home every evening. Routine is comfortable. Routine also happens to be extremely identifiable. Technology doesn't need your name if it already knows where your phone spends every night. Sooner or later, addresses become people, numbers become identities. And that's before considering smartphones. Those miraculous little devices rarely leave our pockets. They're clocks, maps, wallets, music players, cameras, calendars, flashlights, emergency contacts, entertainment centres, fitness trackers, weather stations, portable offices. In exchange for doing everything, they quietly observe almost everything too. Location services can be genuinely useful. Nobody wants navigation that randomly decides you've driven into a lake, but convenience always arrives with trade-offs. Many apps collect far more information than their primary purpose would seem to require. Sometimes a flashlight app apparently wants your location, which raises a perfectly reasonable question. Why? Unless the flashlight intends to illuminate different photons depending on your zip code, the request feels unnecessary. Family safety apps introduce another complicated layer. Parents understandably want reassurance. Knowing children arrive safely at school offers genuine peace of mind. Technology can absolutely provide that. Problems arise when information collected for one reassuring purpose quietly becomes valuable somewhere else. Location data has tremendous commercial value. Paws reveal habits. Habits predict purchases. Purchases generate revenue. Before long, information originally collected to protect families may begin travelling through entirely different commercial pathways. The chain becomes surprisingly difficult to follow. One company shares data with another. That company partners with someone else. Eventually, information arrives somewhere neither users nor perhaps even the original company anticipated. That's one of the most frustrating characteristics of modern data collection. Opaque. Nobody seems entirely certain where information finally ends up. You might willingly share data with an application you trust. That doesn't necessarily mean you'll recognise the fourth or fifth organisation eventually receiving pieces of it. It's like lending your favourite book to one friend, only to discover 6 months later it's somehow sitting on a stranger's coffee table 3 states away. Tracing the journey becomes almost impossible. Every additional transfer creates another layer of uncertainty, another opportunity for mistakes, another opportunity for misuse. Of course, defenders of the system often emphasise that everything technically follows agreed-upon policies. Privacy notices, terms of service, consent forms, all those wonderfully readable documents nobody has ever voluntarily enjoyed. Let's be honest, most online agreements aren't read. They're endured. Presented with 40 pages of legal language before accessing a weather forecast, people generally make the practical decision. Click accept, move on. Life is too short to spend Tuesday afternoon decoding paragraph 17 about third-party analytical partners. Companies know this. The process isn't designed for understanding. It's designed for completion. The button practically glows. Accept, continue, proceed. Congregations, you've successfully exchanged pieces of your digital life for the ability to check tomorrow's temperature. There's something quietly remarkable about how completely we've accepted that bargain. 20 years ago, the idea would have sounded outrageous. Today, it's routine. We've adapted because convenience is extraordinarily persuasive. Human beings consistently choose easier over safer, not because we're foolish, because we're busy. Nobody wakes up excited to become a privacy expert. They simply want directions to the nearest grocery store, or to send a message, or to order dinner. Technology delivers those conveniences brilliantly. The invisible cost simply arrives later. Usually unnoticed, usually unexamined. And that's exactly why the system continues growing, because the less visible something becomes, the easier it is to normalise. The less visible it becomes, the harder it is to question. By this point, I'd gone from mildly curious to deeply uncomfortable, not because I imagined mysterious strangers individually watching my every move. The reality was somehow stranger than that. Nobody needed to watch. Machines already remembered, and the businesses built around those memories had become so enormous that most of us participated without ever seeing the marketplace itself. What worried me most wasn't merely that companies knew things. It was that they kept finding new ways to connect information that had never been intended to exist together. Every disconnected piece gradually became part of a single portrait, a portrait most people had never agreed to paint. And the more I learned about who could eventually buy access to those portraits, the less this looked like a marketing story. It started looking like a power story, one involving corporations, governments, reporters, private investigators, and sometimes people with far darker intentions. That was when the subject stopped being merely unsettling. It became personal. By the time I reached the end of this rabbit hole, I realised the biggest misconception about privacy is the idea that only people with secrets need it. That's never been what privacy was for. Privacy isn't about hiding wrongdoing. It's about deciding which parts of yourself belong to you. Most of us close the bathroom door, not because we're conducting classified government business, because some moments are simply ours. We draw the curtains at night, not because we're plotting international conspiracies. Because existing without an audience feels normal. Nobody asks why you password protect your bank account. Nobody accuses you of suspicious behaviour because you don't hand strangers your house keys. Yet somehow, the moment the conversation turns to digital privacy, people shrug and say, "I've got nothing to hide." That sentence has always fascinated me. Imagine applying it somewhere else. I don't need curtains. I don't need locks. I'll just publish my diary online. At some point, even the most open person starts recognising that boundaries exist for a reason. The internet has quietly convinced us those boundaries are optional. They're not. They're simply harder to notice. One of the most unsettling discoveries wasn't that companies collected information. I'd already accepted that much. It was realising how many different people could eventually obtain it. Advertisers, researchers, political campaigns, government agencies, private investigators, journalists, sometimes people with genuinely malicious intentions. Once information enters a marketplace, control becomes remarkably difficult to recover. Data has an annoying habit of travelling farther than anyone originally intended. Think about gossip in a small town. You tell one person, they tell another. Soon someone you've never met somehow knows what you had for breakfast. Now imagine replacing neighbours with multinational corporations and databases containing billions of records. The scale becomes almost impossible to comprehend. Government agencies present one particularly uncomfortable question. Traditionally, investigators seeking deeply personal information about someone needed legal authorisation. There were rules, oversight, paperwork, judges. The entire process reflected an important principle: power should have limits. Technology complicated that principle. If private companies already possess enormous amounts of information, and that information is legally available for purchase, then governments may simply become customers. No dramatic court order. No late-night raid, just another commercial transaction. Legally speaking, the distinction may matter. Practically speaking, the result often feels surprisingly similar. Information changes hands. Someone learns more about your life than you expected. Most people understandably assume apps dedicated to faith, health, or personal well-being occupy a special category. Surely those deserve extraordinary care. Yet, history has repeatedly shown that assumptions aren't always enough. When deeply personal information begins circulating through commercial systems, trust becomes fragile. People start asking questions they never imagined needing to ask. Who else knows this? Who bought it? Who sold it? Where did it go afterward? The troubling part isn't always finding clear answers, it's discovering how few answers exist at all. The path data follows can resemble an intricate network of rivers. One stream flows into another, then another. Eventually, it's impossible to identify where a single drop originally came from. Responsibility becomes equally difficult to trace. Everyone handled only one small piece. No one seems responsible for the whole. That uncertainty creates opportunities for abuse. Consider people escaping abusive relationships. Starting over often depends upon becoming difficult to find. A new address, a new routine, a chance to rebuild. Now, imagine discovering that pieces of your location remain commercially available to almost anyone willing to pay. Suddenly, technology isn't merely inconvenient, it's frightening. The internet often promises connection. For some people, disconnection is survival. Privacy can literally become a matter of safety. That realization changes the conversation. This stops being about personalized advertisements. Nobody's greatest fear is receiving coupons for lawn furniture. The concern is far more fundamental. Who controls access to your life? Because once that control disappears, recovering it becomes incredibly difficult. People sometimes suggest practical solutions. Use browsers emphasizing privacy, disable unnecessary permissions, limit app tracking, review account settings, delete old applications. They're sensible recommendations, they're also incomplete. Imagine discovering your neighborhood had dangerous traffic because every intersection lacked stop signs. Then authorities advised everyone to become better drivers. That's useful advice. It doesn't solve the intersection. Individual responsibility has limits. Some problems require structural solutions. Privacy increasingly feels like one of them. Other parts of the world have experimented with broader regulations. Some approaches have worked better than others. Businesses adapted, consumers adapted, everyone complained about endless cookie consent banners. The internet briefly became a never-ending parade of tiny windows asking whether you accepted invisible pieces of code. Most people clicked accept simply to continue reading recipes. That experience demonstrated an important lesson. Making privacy possible isn't enough. Making privacy easy matters just as much. If protecting yourself requires 15 confusing steps hidden behind advanced settings, many people simply won't do it. Not because they don't care, because they have jobs, children, bills. Appointments, life. Convenience usually wins. The more I considered all this, the more another question emerged. If the current system persists despite obvious concerns, why? Part of the answer is money. Entire industries benefit enormously from data collection. Information drives advertising. Advertising drives revenue. Revenue funds platforms people use every day. Changing that model would affect countless businesses. Powerful industries rarely volunteer for dramatic reform. That's hardly shocking. The more interesting question involves politics. Campaigns increasingly depend upon detailed voter information. Candidates know neighbourhoods, interests, voting histories, gotsamer habits, communication preferences. Modern elections rely heavily on data analysis. Political professionals celebrate this as sophisticated strategy, and perhaps it is, but it also creates an awkward incentive. The same lawmakers capable of regulating extensive data collection often benefit from its existence. Expecting enthusiastic reform under those circumstances can feel optimistic. Still, history occasionally provides reasons for hope. Sometimes change arrives, not because abstract principles suddenly become persuasive, but because powerful people realize those principles affect them personally. Human beings possess a remarkable talent for ignoring distant problems while reacting instantly to nearby ones. An inconvenience affecting millions may inspire years of discussion. The exact same inconvenience affecting legislators themselves can inspire breathtaking efficiency. Perhaps that's simply human nature. Empathy often travels shortest distances first. The challenge lies in extending it farther. Toward ordinary people, toward strangers, toward individuals whose names never appear in headlines. Technology itself isn't the villain, let's be fair. The same innovations creating privacy concerns also connect families across continents. Help emergency responders, the famed medical research, support education, provide accessibility for people with disabilities, offer opportunities previous generations couldn't imagine. None of those achievements deserve dismissal. Progress rarely arrives without trade-offs. The important question isn't whether technology should exist, it's whether rules evolve alongside it. For decades, society regulated industries after recognizing unintended consequences. Automobiles brought traffic laws, food production brought safety inspections, financial markets brought oversight. Nobody interpreted those measures as declarations that cars, food or banking were inherently evil. They recognised something simpler. Power benefits from accountability. Information represents power. Perhaps it's time accountability catches up. As I look back over everything I'd learned, one thought kept returning. The internet knows astonishing amounts about us, not because we deliberately surrendered our lives, because the surrender happened gradually, one convenient feature at a time, one harmless permission at a time, one cheerful accept button after another. No single moment felt significant. Collectively, they transformed the relationship between individuals and information. We adapted without noticing. Maybe that's the strangest part. The revolution wasn't loud. It arrived disguised as convenience, as recommendations, as personalization, as improved user experiences, as free services. It smiled the entire time. That's what makes invisible systems so difficult to challenge. People rarely rebel against comfort, but comfort shouldn't require permanent surveillance. Connection shouldn't demand constant observation. Innovation shouldn't depend upon collecting every available detail simply because technology makes collection possible. Eventually, society has to ask not merely what can be done, but what should be done. Those are different questions. They're often confused. The first belongs to engineers, the second belongs to everyone else. Perhaps that's the conversation we should be having now. Not whether privacy matters, it always has, not whether technology should disappear. It won't. Instead, how do we preserve something deeply human while embracing something increasingly digital? How do we enjoy extraordinary convenience without quietly surrendering ordinary dignity? Those questions don't have simple answers. They probably never will, but asking them feels infinitely better than pretending they don't exist, because history suggests that rights rarely vanish all at once. They erode gradually, one exception, one convenience. One compromise after another, until eventually people look around and struggle to remember where the boundary once stood. Maybe the most valuable thing we can do is simply notice who's collecting information. Notice what we're agreeing to. Notice which systems deserve skepticism. Notice when convenience quietly asks for more than it needs. Awareness alone won't solve everything, but it's where every meaningful reform begins. The digital world has become astonishingly good at watching us. Perhaps it's time we spent a little more energy watching it.